Retirement. The word alone had always sounded like a reward, the long-awaited prize at the end of years of hard work, endless commutes, and office chatter. For decades, I had dreamed of the day I could finally close my laptop, turn off the alarm clock, and wake up whenever the morning sun chose to touch my face. I had imagined it like a gentle exhale, a golden pause after a lifetime of holding my breath. And now, standing in my small, cluttered office, I was living that very moment. The building felt oddly quiet, the kind of quiet that makes you realize how much of your life had been filled with background noise you never really noticed until it stopped. The hum of the copy machine, the murmur of coworkers, the soft click of keyboards, all of it was fading into memory as I packed up the last of my things. My nameplate came off the door with a faint squeak, leaving a lighter rectangle where the dust hadn't settled. I stared at it for a long moment, realizing that soon someone else's name would take its place. Someone younger, fresher, maybe even hungrier. The desk that had once been my second home now looked foreign. I picked up an old mug with a chipped handle that read, "World's Okayest Employee," and smiled. A gift from a coworker years ago, it had survived 3 reorganizations, 2 promotions, and 1 catastrophic coffee spill that left a stain on my keyboard I'd never managed to clean. Each item I placed in the box held a memory. A photo of me and the team at last year's holiday party. The small potted plant that somehow survived despite my black thumb. A stack of sticky notes covered in reminders that no longer mattered. It was strange how objects could hold pieces of a life you didn't realize you were leaving behind until you started taking them away one by one. By noon, the little farewell party began. Someone brought in a sheet cake with blue icing that read, "Happy retirement, Linda," and a smiley face that looked slightly deformed. There were balloons taped to the wall, a few paper plates, and the familiar smell of burnt coffee from the break room pot. My coworkers gathered around, clapping and cheering, their faces a mix of joy and something else, perhaps envy, perhaps relief that it wasn't their turn yet. I smiled, thanked them for the kind words, listened to a few half-hearted speeches, and accepted a card stuffed with signatures, doodles, and jokes. A few of them hugged me tightly, whispering that they'd miss me, that the place wouldn't be the same without me. I knew that within a week, someone new would sit in my chair and life would continue as if I'd never been there at all. That's the way it goes. Offices are like that, machines that keep running no matter who's at the controls. As I looked around, faces blurred together. People I'd spent years alongside, sharing deadlines and frustrations, laughter and gossip. I realized how much time I'd spent here, how much of my identity had been tied to this place. For 30 years, this job had been my rhythm. Every morning, I'd arrive with my travel mug and sensible shoes, clock in, and let the hours tick by, punctuated by meetings, phone calls, and the occasional birthday celebration in the break room. I'd been reliable, always early, always prepared, the one people turned to when they needed help or advice. There was comfort in that predictability, but also a quiet ache that I'd ignored for too long. Somewhere along the line, life outside the office had grown smaller, quieter, like a room slowly running out of air. When the last slice of cake was eaten and the final hugs were given, I walked back to my desk one last time. The room was empty now, and the silence pressed against me like a heavy blanket. My monitor was dark, my chair pushed neatly under the desk. For years, this had been my view. The same window overlooking the parking lot, the same tree that bloomed pink every spring, the same coffee pot that hissed and dripped in the corner. It felt almost wrong to leave it all behind, as though I were abandoning an old friend. But then again, maybe it was time. I gathered my last box, turned off the light, and stepped out into the hallway. The echo of my footsteps followed me down the corridor, a sound I'd heard 1,000 times but never really listened to until now. Outside, the sunlight hit me like a blessing. The air was crisp and bright, carrying the faint scent of fresh-cut grass and exhaust fumes from the street. For the first time in years, I had nowhere to be. No deadlines, no meetings, no one expecting me to show up and perform. The weight that had sat on my shoulders for decades began to lift, slowly, cautiously, like a bird testing its wings. I stood there in the parking lot, breathing in the cool air, and let myself imagine what came next. Maybe I'd travel, see the places I'd only ever read about. Maybe I'd finally take that painting class I'd talked about for years but never found the time for. Maybe I'd just rest, sleep in, wake up late. Spend mornings drinking coffee on the porch without worrying about traffic or emails. The world suddenly seemed wide open, full of possibilities that had been waiting quietly on the other side of obligation. The drive home felt different that day. The radio played an old song from my youth, and before I knew it, I was singing along, windows rolled down, wind whipping through my hair. It felt good, freeing even, like I'd just remembered a version of myself I hadn't seen in decades. When I pulled into the driveway, the late afternoon sun cast everything in gold. My little house looked cozy and familiar, a refuge I'd built with years of work and careful planning. I parked the car, grabbed my suitcase and a couple of boxes, and made my way to the front door. My hands trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the strange mix of excitement and uncertainty that comes with closing one chapter and stepping into another. Inside, the house was quiet. My daughter Emily was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, scrolling mindlessly. She barely looked up when I walked in. That was fine. She was 28, independent, busy with her own life. Still, a small part of me hoped for something. A smile, a hug, maybe even a simple, "Congratulations." I set my suitcase down with a little flourish and said, "Well, that's it. I'm officially retired." I expected at least a flicker of excitement, a trace of pride. For a brief moment, I thought I saw something warm in her eyes, but then she rolled them and sighed. "So what now?" she said sharply. "You're just going to sit around all day? You might as well die. You're only good for money, old hag." The words hit harder than any blow could. My heart stuttered in my chest, my breath caught halfway. For a second I thought I must have misheard her. Surely she was joking. But when I looked at her face, I saw no humor there, only cold indifference. The air seemed to drain from the room. My throat burned, but no words came out. I tried to smile, to pretend it didn't matter, but inside I was collapsing. Years of sacrifice flashed before me, late nights, skipped vacations, endless worry, all for her. Every choice I'd made had been about giving her a better life, a future free from struggle. And here she was, cutting me down with a single cruel sentence. I wanted to say something, to defend myself, to remind her of everything I'd done, but my voice betrayed me. I just stood there, holding my suitcase, feeling like a stranger in my own home. She went back to her phone as if nothing had happened, as if I hadn't just shattered inside. I watched her for a while, searching for the little girl I used to know, the one who used to run into my arms after school, who used to cling to me when she had nightmares. But that girl was gone. What stood before me was someone else entirely. My chest ached as I turned away and carried my suitcase upstairs. Each step felt heavier, as though the air itself resisted me. In my room, the quiet felt suffocating. I sat on the edge of the bed, still dressed in my office clothes, and finally let the tears fall. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet, steady tears that carried years of exhaustion, disappointment, and heartbreak. Downstairs, I could hear the faint tapping of her thumbs on her phone, indifferent to my silence. I'd imagined this day so differently. I thought it would be filled with laughter, with celebration, maybe even a little pride. I thought I'd finally be appreciated for all I'd given. Instead, I felt emptier than ever, surrounded by the hollow echo of everything I'd built unraveling in a single moment. I sat there for a long time, motionless, listening to the sound of my own breathing. The quiet was different now, not peaceful, but heavy, filled with something sharp and invisible. The house, once alive with the sounds of laughter, footsteps, and music, now felt foreign to me. I looked around the room, my eyes landing on the framed photos on the dresser. Emily as a child, her toothy grin bright under the summer sun. Me holding her in my arms on her first day of school. The two of us at the park, ice cream dripping down our hands as we laughed. Each picture was a story, a memory frozen in time, a testament to love and sacrifice. I had built my world around that little girl. Every decision I made, every late night I worked, every dream I postponed, everything had been for her. And now, that love had turned into something cold and distant. I could still hear her words echoing in my head, sharp and cruel, like glass breaking inside my chest. It wasn't just the insult that hurt, it was what it revealed. The truth behind the words, the years of subtle disrespect I'd ignored. The way she'd grown short-tempered, dismissive, always acting as if my presence was a burden rather than a comfort. I had told myself it was a phase, that she was just stressed, that she'd come around eventually. But now I could see that this wasn't new. It had been building for years, growing quietly in the spaces between our conversations, hiding behind her sighs, her impatience, her indifference. I had raised her to be independent, strong, unafraid to speak her mind. But somewhere along the way, I had also taught her something else, that my needs didn't matter, that I would always forgive, that I would keep giving no matter how much it hurt. I wiped my face and stood up, pacing slowly across the room. The floor creaked under my feet, a sound that once comforted me, now hollow and distant. I thought about the years I'd spent working to make her life easier. The school tuition, the late-night study sessions, the endless driving back and forth to lessons, events, interviews. I remembered sitting in the audience at her college graduation, my heart swelling with pride as she walked across the stage. I had cried that day, not just because I was proud, but because I thought I had done it. I thought I had succeeded as a mother. I thought all the sacrifice had meant something. I didn't realize that in giving her everything, I had left nothing for myself. The next morning, I made breakfast like I always did: eggs, toast, coffee. Habit, I suppose. She came downstairs, barely looking at me, scrolling through her phone as she grabbed a plate. "Morning," I said quietly, trying to sound normal. She just nodded, muttered something that sounded like "yeah," and sat down. The silence between us stretched, thick and uncomfortable. I wanted to talk to her, to ask her what had changed, to reach out and bridge the growing gap between us. But fear held me back, fear of hearing something I wasn't ready to face. So instead, I focused on my coffee, watching the steam curl and fade into the air. As the days passed, the house seemed to grow smaller. Emily came and went, her moods unpredictable, her words often curt. Sometimes she ignored me completely. Other times, she snapped at me for things I didn't understand. The warmth that once filled our home had vanished, replaced by tension that lingered like smoke after a fire. I tried to busy myself, gardening, reading, reorganizing old boxes, but the silence always crept back in. I'd catch myself staring out the window, lost in thoughts that felt too heavy to name. At night, when she was out with friends or asleep, I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every conversation, every missed opportunity, every small kindness I'd taken for granted. I wondered if I had done something wrong, if I had failed her somehow, if I had loved her in the wrong way. Parenthood doesn't come with instructions. You do your best, you give what you can, and you hope it's enough. But sometimes it isn't. Sometimes love, no matter how deep, isn't enough to stop someone from drifting away. One evening, I decided to clean out the attic, something I'd been meaning to do for years. Dust coated everything in a soft gray film, and the air was thick with the smell of old wood and forgotten time. As I opened boxes, I found pieces of my past, letters from friends I'd lost touch with, a stack of birthday cards, a collection of photo albums. There was a box filled with Emily's old toys, worn and faded but still precious. A small stuffed bear missing an ear, a tiny pink shoe, a drawing she'd made of the two of us holding hands. I sat down on the floor, holding that drawing in my lap, and for the first time in a long while, I smiled. For a moment I could feel that old warmth again, the bond that had once seemed unbreakable. But as the smile faded, I felt something else, a deep, aching loneliness that seemed to reach into my bones. I realized then how much I had disappeared into the role of mother. It had been my identity, my purpose, my entire existence. I had forgotten what it meant to be just Linda, the woman who used to love music, who used to paint on weekends, who used to dream of traveling the world. Somewhere between the bills, the responsibilities, and the endless giving, I had lost her. And now, with Emily grown and distant, I didn't know how to find her again. The thought terrified me, because if I wasn't a mother, if I wasn't needed anymore, then who was I? That question followed me everywhere. It lingered in the kitchen as I cooked dinner for one. It whispered through the halls as I moved from room to room. It haunted me in the quiet moments when the clock ticked too loudly and the night seemed too long. I started to notice how small my world had become, how I rarely went out, how my phone never rang except for spam calls, how the friends I once had drifted away over time. Retirement was supposed to be freedom, but it felt more like isolation. One afternoon, I went for a walk in the park, hoping the fresh air might clear my head. Children played on the swings, their laughter bright and sharp against the autumn air. Couples strolled hand in hand. Joggers passed by with focused expressions. Life was happening all around me, but I felt like I was standing outside of it, watching through glass. I sat on a bench and closed my eyes, listening to the rustle of leaves, the distant bark of a dog, the hum of traffic beyond the trees. For a moment I let myself breathe, really breathe. It was then that I realized how long it had been since I had done something simply for myself. When I returned home, Emily was sitting in the living room watching TV. I stood there, watching her, wanting to say something, anything, to bridge the distance between us. But when I opened my mouth, the words died before they reached my tongue. She didn't look up. She didn't notice the tears that welled up in my eyes, or the way my hands trembled slightly at my sides. She just kept scrolling, laughing softly at something on her screen. That sound, that small, careless laugh, cut through me deeper than any insult could. It was the sound of indifference, of a heart that no longer cared whether I was there or not. I turned away, retreating into the kitchen. I gripped the counter to steady myself, my reflection faint in the darkened window. I looked older than I remembered, tired, hollow, small. I thought about all the times I had chosen to be kind instead of angry, patient instead of resentful. I had believed that love was enough, that time would heal whatever was broken. But standing there, surrounded by the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of the television, I realized that sometimes love without respect is just servitude. That night, as I lay in bed, I stared at the ceiling and let the memories wash over me. The laughter, the arguments, the sacrifices, the endless giving. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the pain and the exhaustion, a small, stubborn spark began to flicker. A voice that whispered, faint but firm, that it wasn't too late to find myself again, to remember who I was before I became everything to everyone else. That maybe, just maybe, the rest of my life could still belong to me. The next morning, I woke up before the sun. The house was still, wrapped in the kind of quiet that feels both comforting and haunting. I sat on the edge of the bed for a while, my hands resting in my lap, staring at the floor as pale light crept across the room. Something inside me felt different, subtle but undeniable. It wasn't peace, not yet, but maybe the faint outline of it. Maybe the first breath after drowning. I got up, made myself a cup of tea, and stood by the window watching the world outside slowly wake. The sky was streaked with pink and gold, the air crisp, the trees bending gently in the breeze. For years I'd been too busy to notice mornings like this. I'd always been rushing, packing lunches, answering emails, checking the clock, trying to fit too much into days that never felt long enough. But now there was nowhere to be. Now I could simply stand and exist, and yet, even in that stillness, I could feel the ache of everything that had been lost. I spent the morning cleaning, moving through the rooms with a kind of quiet determination. Dusting shelves, folding laundry, wiping down counters. The ordinary rhythm of it was grounding somehow, each small act pulling me back into my body. In the living room, I paused by the photo wall. Pictures of family vacations, birthdays, graduations, all those frozen smiles staring back at me. I touched one of the frames, tracing the outline of Emily's face when she was little. There was innocence there, love unguarded and simple. It made me think of how time changes people, how it strips away the softness layer by layer until what's left is harder, colder, shaped by pain and pride. Maybe she wasn't cruel on purpose. Maybe she was just lost too, in her own way. Maybe life had hardened her before she even realized it. Still, I couldn't ignore the sharpness of her words, the way they had carved into me and left something raw and trembling behind. I had spent too many years making excuses for others, minimizing my own pain. I told myself that being understanding was strength, that patience was love. But sometimes patience becomes a cage. Sometimes understanding becomes surrender. I thought about that as I washed the dishes, the water running warm over my hands. For so long, I had believed that love meant endurance, that if I just held on long enough, things would get better. But holding on had only left me bleeding. That afternoon, I decided to go into town. It had been months since I'd gone anywhere besides the grocery store. The streets were busy, filled with people moving in every direction, their faces a blur of motion and purpose. I felt invisible among them, and oddly, that was comforting. I wandered through a small bookshop, breathing in the familiar scent of paper and ink. The owner, an older man with kind eyes, smiled and nodded as I entered. I drifted along the aisles, letting my fingers brush against the spines of books. I used to love reading, used to lose myself in stories for hours, but somewhere along the line, I had stopped. Life had gotten in the way. Responsibilities, exhaustion, the slow erosion of time. I picked up a novel and flipped through it, feeling a flicker of something I hadn't felt in a long time. Curiosity. Afterward, I stopped at a cafe and ordered a coffee. I sat by the window, watching people pass by, couples holding hands, friends laughing, children tugging at their parents' sleeves. For the first time, I allowed myself to just observe without envy or regret. The world moved on, with or without me, and somehow that realization didn't hurt as much as I expected. It was freeing in a quiet, bittersweet way. I had spent so much of my life trying to belong, to be needed, to be useful. But maybe belonging didn't have to mean losing myself. Maybe I could exist simply for me. When I got home, Emily wasn't there. Her shoes were gone, her jacket missing from the hook. The silence was thicker than usual, but I didn't mind it. I made myself dinner, something simple, vegetable soup and a slice of bread, and ate it by the kitchen window. The air was cool, carrying the faint sound of crickets outside. I thought about calling her, about trying to talk, but I stopped myself. For once I wanted to let the silence stand. I wanted to see what it felt like not to chase, not to beg for scraps of affection. Maybe she needed space. Maybe I did too. Later that night, I went through an old trunk in my room, filled with things I hadn't looked at in years. Letters from friends, postcards from places I'd dreamed of visiting, sketches I'd done back when I still painted. My fingers trembled as I lifted a small canvas, a landscape I'd painted when Emily was still a toddler. It was a field of wildflowers under a wide blue sky. I remembered sitting by the window one afternoon, brush in hand, while she played with her toys on the floor beside me. She had looked up at me then, her face glowing with wonder, and said, "Mommy, it's beautiful." That memory hit me like a wave. I could almost hear her voice, high and sweet, see the tiny smudge of paint she'd left on her cheek when she'd reached for my brush. I set the painting down and closed my eyes. Somewhere deep inside, a small, fragile truth began to form. The understanding that I had lived too long waiting for others to see me, to value me, to give me permission to exist. I had spent decades defining myself through the roles I played: employee, mother, provider, caretaker. But I had never truly known myself beyond those titles. I had forgotten the woman who used to dream, who used to create, who used to find joy in the simple act of being alive. That realization scared me as much as it healed me, because it meant I had to start over from nothing. It meant I had to rebuild a self I had abandoned a long time ago. The days that followed were quiet, but different. I started small. I went for morning walks. I cooked meals I actually enjoyed, instead of just what was convenient. I pulled my old paints out from storage and set up a small corner in the spare room as an art space. The first time I lifted a brush again, my hands shook. The strokes were clumsy, uncertain, but each color that bloomed on the canvas felt like a breath of life returning. It wasn't about perfection. It was about remembering that I still existed, that I still had something inside me worth expressing. Sometimes, I'd catch Emily watching me from the doorway. She never said much, just stood there for a few seconds before walking away. I didn't press her. I knew that whatever was broken between us couldn't be fixed with words alone. It would take time, and maybe it would never fully mend. But I had stopped trying to force it. I had stopped apologizing for things that weren't my fault. One evening, as I was washing the paint from my brushes, I heard her voice behind me. "You've been painting again," she said softly. I turned, surprised. She was leaning against the doorframe, her expression unreadable. "Yeah," I said after a moment. "I used to, before everything got so busy." She nodded, her gaze flickering to the half-finished painting on the easel, a sunset over a quiet lake. "It's nice," she murmured. And then she was gone. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't affection, but it was something, a small crack in the wall that had grown between us. That night, I stood by my bedroom window, looking up at the moon. The world outside was still, the air cool against the glass. I thought about all the years I had spent giving, the years I had spent waiting for someone to tell me I was enough. But maybe the truth was simpler than I'd ever realized. Maybe the only person who could give me that was me, and so I began again, not as a mother or a retiree, not as someone defined by what she had lost, but as a woman who had finally decided to live on her own terms. The pain was still there, lingering like a shadow, but beneath it was something else too. Strength. Quiet, steady strength. The kind that doesn't shout or demand attention, but simply endures, like the roots of a tree weathering every storm and still holding firm beneath the earth. The following weeks unfolded like slow breaths, each day stretching quietly into the next. I found myself slipping into a new rhythm, one not dictated by alarm clocks or deadlines, but by the gentle pulse of time itself. Mornings became sacred. I would wake early, sometimes before dawn, and sit on the porch with a cup of coffee, wrapped in a blanket, as the first light crept across the sky. The silence no longer felt heavy. It felt alive. I could hear the hum of the world waking up. Birds calling from the trees, the distant bark of a neighbor's dog, the soft rustle of wind against the leaves. There was peace in those sounds, a kind of reassurance that life, despite everything, continued to move forward. I began to understand that healing didn't come all at once. It came slowly, quietly, in the ordinary moments when I allowed myself to simply be. Some days, I painted for hours, losing track of time as color spilled across canvas. Other days, I took long walks through the park, watching children play and old couples feed the ducks by the pond. Sometimes, I would stop by the library or sit in the cafe I'd visited that first day, reading or sketching or just observing life around me. People watching had become a comfort. There was something grounding about seeing the small, fleeting gestures of strangers, the way someone smiled at their partner, the way a child clung to their mother's hand. It reminded me that even though my own story had been fractured, it was still part of something vast and human and endlessly unfolding. Emily and I spoke little at first. The distance between us had taken on a quiet rhythm of its own. She would come and go, sometimes offering a polite nod, sometimes nothing at all. But I had stopped waiting for her to change. I no longer built my days around her moods or her silences. Instead, I focused on reclaiming the pieces of myself I had neglected. I cleaned out closets, donating old clothes and boxes of things I no longer needed. It was more than tidying. It was shedding, peeling away layers of a past that no longer fit. Each item I let go of felt like a small act of freedom. One morning, while going through an old drawer, I found a letter I'd written years ago, but never sent. It was to myself, dated on my 40th birthday. The handwriting was neat, hopeful. I read the words slowly, almost like reading a stranger's thoughts. I had written about dreams I wanted to chase once Emily was grown, about traveling to Italy, learning to dance, writing a book. I had promised myself that I wouldn't lose sight of who I was. And yet, somewhere along the line, I had broken that promise. Holding that letter now, decades later, I felt a swell of sadness, but also determination. The woman who wrote those words still lived inside me. She had just been waiting, patient and quiet, for me to remember her. So I began to plan small adventures. Nothing grand at first. A trip to the art museum, a weekend visit to the beach, a drive through the countryside with no destination in mind. Each outing reminded me that the world was still wide, still beautiful, still full of things worth seeing. I started taking photos again, capturing light as it shifted across the sky, the way waves curled against the shore, the way strangers laughed together in cafes. I realized I didn't need anyone else's permission to experience joy. I didn't need to be needed to feel alive. One afternoon, as I sat painting by the window, Emily came home earlier than usual. She hovered by the door for a moment, watching me. Her expression was softer than it had been in months. "You've been busy," she said quietly, her voice cautious. I smiled and nodded, continuing to mix colors on my palette. "It helps," I replied simply. She hesitated, then walked closer, glancing at the canvas. "It's beautiful," she murmured, her tone almost surprised. "Thanks," I said. There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I didn't mean what I said that day," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the floor. "I was angry. I don't know why I said it. Her words were halting, uncertain, but they carried the weight of something real. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to cry, another part wanted to stay silent. Finally, I said, "I know." It was all that needed to be said. She nodded, then turned to leave, and for the first time, I didn't feel empty watching her go. Something inside me had settled. Forgiveness, I realized, wasn't about erasing the hurt. It was about releasing yourself from its grip. That night, I sat outside again, watching the stars. The sky was clear, vast, endless. I thought about how many nights I'd spent sitting under that same sky, feeling small, afraid, uncertain. But now that smallness didn't frighten me. It felt right, even comforting. There was something humbling about realizing how vast the universe was, how fleeting our lives were within it. And yet within that vastness, every small act still mattered. The laughter shared, the kindness given, the courage to start again. The next morning, I woke up and decided to drive out to the lake. The road wound through rolling hills and clusters of trees painted gold by the early autumn light. When I arrived, the water was still, reflecting the sky like glass. I sat on the dock, shoes off, feet dangling above the surface. The quiet wrapped around me, and I felt something loosen deep inside my chest. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't thinking about what had been or what might come next. I was simply there, breathing, alive. The wind brushed my face, carrying the faint scent of pine and water. I closed my eyes and let it move through me. When I got home later that evening, Emily was sitting in the kitchen. She had cooked dinner, a simple meal, pasta and salad, and was setting 2 plates on the table. She looked up as I entered, a tentative smile playing at her lips. "Thought you might be hungry," she said. I paused, watching her for a moment before sitting down. The gesture was small, but it felt like something fragile and precious. We ate mostly in silence, the air between us softer than before. I didn't need her to apologize again. Sometimes, love comes back in quieter forms, through actions instead of words, through the willingness to simply share space again. Over the following days, our conversations grew easier. She asked about my paintings, about the places I wanted to visit. I listened as she spoke about her job, her struggles, her fears. I realized then that she wasn't the cold, unfeeling daughter I had convinced myself she'd become. She was just young, lost, trying to find her own footing in a world that could be cruel and confusing. Maybe she lashed out because she didn't know how else to cope. Maybe she saw in me a reflection of everything she feared becoming. Understanding that didn't excuse her words, but it softened their weight. In the quiet evenings that followed, we sometimes watched movies together, sharing laughter that felt cautious at first, but slowly grew genuine. It wasn't the same as before. It was something new, something fragile but real. I didn't cling to it or try to force it into what it once was. I simply let it exist. And in the stillness of those nights, after she'd gone to bed, I would return to my easel. I painted the moments I couldn't put into words. The light spilling through the window, the way the sky changed colors before rain, the reflection of the moon on still water. Each brushstroke was a piece of healing, a reminder that even after everything, beauty could still be created from the ruins. There was a quiet truth I came to understand then, that life doesn't end when something breaks. Sometimes it truly begins in the act of piecing yourself back together. Each fragment carries a story, and when you arrange them with patience, they form something stronger, something more whole than before. And as I stood there one night, looking at the painting before me, a field bathed in morning light, a figure standing in the distance, small but unbroken, I finally recognized her. The woman I had once been, the woman I had fought to become again. Time didn't rush anymore. It unfolded like a gentle tide, steady and unhurried. Each day carried its own quiet rhythm, a balance between solitude and connection that felt strangely perfect. My mornings began with the same ritual, a cup of tea by the window, watching sunlight drift across the kitchen floor, listening to the low hum of life outside. I'd never noticed before how peaceful those small moments could be, how grounding it was to just sit and breathe without thinking about what needed to be done next. The world outside my window was the same as it had always been, yet it felt entirely new, as if I were seeing it through clearer eyes. I had learned to appreciate the slowness of time, the way everything unfolded at its own pace when I stopped trying to control it. Emily and I had begun to speak more regularly, our conversations no longer edged with anger or guilt, but filled with a tentative kind of warmth. Sometimes she'd call just to tell me about her day, about a new recipe she tried, or a funny story from work. Other times, she'd ask for advice, not out of dependence, but out of trust. It was different now. Our relationship had shifted from obligation to choice. We were two women, learning to know each other all over again, not through the lens of mother and daughter, but as human beings, flawed and resilient, both carrying scars that no longer defined us. I realized that letting go of the need to be everything for her had given us both space to grow. I had stopped rescuing her, and in doing so, I had rescued myself. There were still quiet evenings when the house felt too still, when memories crept in uninvited. I'd remember her as a child, her laughter echoing through the halls, the smell of cookies baking in the oven, the way she'd curl up beside me on the couch. Nostalgia was a tricky thing, sweet and painful all at once. But instead of pushing those memories away, I let them come. They reminded me that love, even when it hurts, is still worth having. They reminded me that every chapter, no matter how hard, shapes who we become. I found new meaning in the ordinary. Trips to the grocery store became little adventures. Walks through the park became moments of reflection. I started volunteering at the library, helping children pick out books and reading to them during story hour. Their laughter filled the quiet spaces of my life, and in their curious eyes, I saw the same spark I used to see in Emily's when she was small. I realized that love doesn't vanish, it transforms. Sometimes it softens, sometimes it changes shape, but it never truly disappears. It lingers in the ways we show up for the world, in the kindness we offer without expecting anything in return. Every Sunday, I attended a local art fair where I displayed my paintings. At first, I was nervous. Those canvases felt like pieces of my heart on display, but the response was overwhelming. Strangers would stop, drawn by the colors, asking what inspired each piece. I'd tell them fragments of the truth, that life had changed me, that sometimes beauty grows from heartbreak. One woman, a widow around my age, stood in front of one of my landscapes for a long time before turning to me with tears in her eyes. "It feels like hope," she said quietly. That single word stayed with me. Hope. It was what I had been searching for all along without realizing it. As the months passed, my world grew wider again. I joined a hiking group, spent weekends exploring trails I'd never seen before, and rediscovered the thrill of movement, of feeling my body strong and capable. I made new friends, people who didn't know me as Emily's mother, or as a retiree, or as anyone's anything. They knew me simply as Linda. It was liberating. We'd share stories over coffee after our walks, laughing about our aches and blisters, swapping memories and dreams like old postcards. I learned that new beginnings didn't always come with fireworks. Sometimes they arrived quietly, disguised as ordinary mornings and unexpected friendships. Occasionally, I'd visit the cafe where Emily and I had reconciled. I'd sit at our old table, sipping tea, watching other mothers and daughters talk and laugh. I wondered if they knew how precious those moments were, how easily words could build or break a bond. The memory of that rainy day was still vivid. The way her hands trembled when she handed me the note, the softness in her voice when she said she understood. That day had changed everything, not just for her, but for me too. It had been the moment I realized that love wasn't about sacrifice. It was about strength, boundaries, and the courage to step away when you're being diminished. It was about choosing yourself, not in defiance of others, but in honor of the life you've built. Sometimes, I caught myself thinking about the old me, the woman who measured her worth by how much she could give, how much she could endure. I didn't resent her anymore. She had done what she needed to do to survive. But now I was someone else entirely. I had learned to live gently, to find balance instead of control. I no longer filled the silence with noise or the emptiness with obligation. I let things be unfinished, imperfect, human. That was enough. One evening, Emily came to visit, unannounced but smiling. She carried a small wrapped package and placed it on the table. "Open it," she said shyly. Inside was a framed print of one of my paintings, the one with the sunrise over the lake. She'd written something on the back in her neat handwriting. "For Mom, who taught me that letting go isn't losing, it's loving differently." My throat tightened as I read it. I looked up at her, and for a moment we just stood there, eyes locked, no words necessary. That small gesture meant more than any apology ever could. After she left that night, I hung the painting on the wall above my writing desk. It caught the morning light perfectly, filling the room with a soft golden glow. Every time I looked at it, I felt a quiet pride, not just for the art itself, but for the life I had rebuilt piece by piece. There was beauty in its simplicity, a reflection of how far I'd come. I had learned that peace wasn't something you stumbled upon by chance. It was something you created, one decision, one boundary, one breath at a time. As the year came full circle, the seasons changed again. Leaves turned gold, then fell, carpeting the ground in a whisper of endings and beginnings. I stood by the window, watching them dance in the wind, and thought about how everything in life moves in cycles. Growth, loss, renewal. We spend so much time fearing change, clinging to what's familiar, that we forget how necessary it is. Sometimes the hardest goodbyes are the ones that set us free. Sometimes the pain we resist becomes the doorway to everything we've been waiting for. I began to write again, filling journals with thoughts and reflections. Not stories for anyone else to read, but quiet records of the life I was now living. I wrote about forgiveness, about courage, about the strange sweetness of solitude. I wrote about Emily, about the love that had been tested and reshaped, but never destroyed. I wrote about the woman I had become, a woman who no longer feared endings because she had learned how to begin again. There were nights when I still felt lonely, when the silence pressed in too close, and I wondered what the future would hold. But even in those moments, I didn't feel lost anymore. I had built something inside me that no one could take away, a sense of belonging that came not from others, but from within. I had found a rhythm to my days, a reason to wake up each morning with curiosity instead of dread. Life was quieter now, but it was fuller too, richer in ways I hadn't expected. And as I stood one evening on the porch, the air cool against my skin, the stars bright above, I thought about how strange and beautiful it all was, the way a single decision, a single note could ripple outward and change everything. Maybe that's what growth really is. Not a loud transformation, but a soft unfolding, like petals opening to the light. I closed my eyes and breathed deeply, the night air filling my lungs, the world stretching endlessly before me, waiting to be lived.